Is this live?
So we're on.
Okay.
We're on. Got it.
It's fine.
Okay. Keep talking. We'll set it up, and then we'll go live. Oh, one other thing, we're going to take questions from the audience. So
Great.
Oh, it's good to tell us.
So at the end, I'll tell you when there are questions.
Okay. But my question was, can they actually hear what I'm saying now?
Oh, that's a good question. Let's find out.
Because it might change the conversation.
Yeah.
Oh, can they hear you right now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
They couldn't before. Don't worry.
Okay.
They can hear you now. Sorry. That was a terrible moment to press play. Don't worry. We're fine. We're fine. Nobody heard.
I'm so thoroughly prepared.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is really fun. So you are enjoying working at
Yeah,
That's such a good group.
it's fantastic. I feel like a very corny swelling of joy about the team.
Good fit, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it really is like, because you were saying like you didn't know what your beat was, because your beat was like whatever you thought was interesting, but that's like the whole
Yeah.
beat there.
Yeah.
Is like, this is like cool or something about it.
I was just this morning, so I wrote this thing about how metacognition, like the construct of metacognition, is very much parallel, or could just be a retelling of the Freudian superego. And as a part
like
of
a little less judgy.
Oh well, yeah.
But yeah, same kind of idea.
But it's like the mechanism of self-monitoring.
Right.
So this cognitive psychologist who was making these claims wrote this really fascinating essay about contemporary applications of Freud. And one of the points that he makes is that psychology is, by its nature, an intersectional discipline.
Right.
And all of these, the emergent fields of psychology either reach for a prefix or suffix of seriousness, with like a neuro at the front, or a science at the back. There's a timidity around just being a psychologist.
Oh, absolutely. When I was, so I started out I was going to be a chemist, and I went most of my way through college in chemistry, and then a couple of things happened. I took a psych class in order to fulfill a course requirement, and it was fascinating. It was really, really, really good class. Also, at the same time, I had this realization that if I was a chemist, I'd basically spend my whole life working on like a protein. And because there was so much that's known in chemistry, and in psych, there was, what I kept hearing every day was that there was so much that was unknown, and so much we didn't understand. So it felt like there were all these great puzzles there. But I came home to tell like my parents that I was going to switch and not be a chemist anymore and be a psychologist instead, and they were devastated. I mean, they were like, no, like a psychologist is like that's not a scientist, that's not a real thing. Like that's like the person who does marriage counseling at the community center. That's not and I was like, well, actually those people are valuable too, but it's actually not the kind of psychologist I want to be. And there is definitely, I think, when I went to grad school, I remember one of my interviews with one of the faculty, because I had been a chemistry major, I had taken chemistry and physics and calculus and all of this hard science stuff. And in the interview with one of the faculty members, he was looking at my background stuff, and he's like, "Oh, you've had all this great hard science, you've had physics and yeah." And he's like, "That's great. That's going to be really useful." And even at the time, I was like, "No, it's not. There's no way that my quantum physics class is going to be useful." But there's sort of eagerness to feel like, and I feel it still, and I feel like there are definitely people that don't really think of psychology as a science on par with even medicine or like something that still has a lot of interaction with humans. And of course, there's we have some issues, right? And they're very public, and so that doesn't help when we have a replication crisis. That is, But I think there's just also not a lot of knowledge out there about what psychology as a science looks like and how it's practiced as a science. And that's our fault too, because we're not doing enough as a field to educate people about why, to talk about our findings. I mean, I wrote, the first book that I wrote was me being frustrated by the fact that there was 40 years worth of great research on motivation and how people can reach goals and what the actual pitfalls are, and it's not the stuff you think it is, and what strategies are actually useful and not the ones you think are, and because our intuitions are so terrible about motivation. Yeah. So there's like there's 40 years of people studying this, and we know so much, and like none of it is in the public sphere because nobody writes in English like regular people. We write it in journal articles, and the sort of the denser a journal article is, the more like bonus points you get for how sciencey it is. And so nobody reads it. And and now actually, I mean, there is like Science Plus, there's more science writing, the really good science writing about psychology as a science, which is awesome, but that wasn't true, 10, 20 years ago. So people just don't know that it's a science. They don't know what it looks like as a science, and they don't know what it gets them, what the value is. It's changing, which is good. Again, the replication crisis doesn't really help, but we're getting past that. I think it's really it's exciting. I have friends on both sides of that issue.
But I think what's amazing is that so many of these immortal questions that recur every generation, the psychology is able to put some to less so it with empiricism.
Yeah, it's remarkable the number of times Aristotle comes up in a journal article as a reference of Aristotle said this 2,000 years ago. What is the nature of happiness and what its relationship is to well-being, and so to be able to grab a hold of those sorts of things and then say, okay, well, here's some of what we can say to it. It's cool, and here's where the intuitions were right, and here's where the intuitions were wrong. Where the intuitions are wrong is like the most fun, because that's, for me, that's what makes us useful, because honestly, if all we did was tell people, people like being happy, then really we shouldn't get paid to do that. So, you can say something more interesting, that's good.
So I am Drake Baer. I'm a senior writer for New York Magazine's Science of Us. And I have the privilege of being at the Helio World Headquarters with Columbia University's social psychologist, Heidi Grant.
You can read the book name?
You can do
my last book is No One Understands You and What to Do About It. Just sort of a mouthful, so I offered to say it myself.
Yeah, so I think that's a great point of disembarkation. I have found in my own very awkward social life that there is indeed a gap between how I perceive myself and how other people perceive me. So what's going on there? Why are we such strangers to ourselves?
So there's really two things going on, right? One is that to some extent we are strangers to ourselves. We don't often know ourselves as well as we think we do. But a lot of it is also just simply that even though we are all, and this is the great irony of it, even though we are all perceivers, we are all expert perceivers, we all walk around every day trying to make sense of other people's behavior, we don't understand how we do that. And so most of the machinery of perception is unconscious. Right? The vast majority of what goes into how we interpret another person's behavior is stuff that we don't even realize we're doing, and so we make assessments of other people, we form impressions of them, we don't really know how we do that. We make up stories later about why I don't like so and so, but really there's a lot happening under the hood that we're not seeing. And then because we don't know how it works, we then lack insight into how our own behaviors come across to other people. So that's been really interesting for me as a psychologist, and it's a big part of social psychology. I think a big chunk of what we do is that understanding that whole dynamic, right? Trying to figure out how people make sense of one another, whether interactions go well or smoothly depending on certain behaviors, what brings out certain kinds of behaviors. The bottom line is that because we don't actually see ourselves, react. You know, we have a sense of how we're coming across. We typically don't know what we're doing with our faces. We don't know what we're doing with our bodies. We're sending lots of signals with our faces and our bodies, but we don't know what signals those are. So that's a big part of the problem. People are using that information, but we don't even know what we're sending. And then we have all this access to information that they don't have, right? We know what we're thinking. We know what we're feeling. We know what our intentions are toward other people. Other people don't know any of those things. There's, I'm sure you know of it, that there's this phenomenon called the illusion of transparency that basically like all humans are subject to. We all think we're much more of an open book than we actually are. So we feel like, you know, there's this expression, it goes without saying, and people use it all the time. Like, oh, well, you didn't tell me you like that. Well, it goes without saying. It doesn't. Like, nothing goes without saying. Things should kind of go with saying, because often people really have very limited information trying to understand you, and they're doing the best they can. So it's tempting to get mad when people don't get you and feel like, you know, just sort of brood and feel not that I'm sure you brood, but that you know, it's tempting to do that when really we kind of need to, I think, recognize that if we go a little bit of the extra mile and put in a little more effort and be a little more deliberate about the signals we send, then we can help people to get us much more easily. But it takes effort. You kind of can't just sort of sit back and assume that everyone's going to get you.
It makes me think about a few weeks ago, I interviewed a relationship psychologist who does marriage counseling and has done so here in Manhattan for 15, 20 years. And I forced him, as a journalist is wont to do, to boil down his advice to one point. And he said, he talked about emotional fluency.
Oh, yeah.
The best thing you can do is to be able to express your interior state in such a way that your partner can empathize with you. Yeah. And it's exactly this sort of gap, because if you can't put, if you don't put it into words, then all they have is your behavior.
Right.
And so if you're retreating into your phone,
right.
if you're just, like, for instance, if you're stressed about an upcoming meeting, and that stress manifests as being aloof or maybe being manic, all your partner has to read is the data that you give them.
Exactly.
And then they might want, and then that primes recrimination. Rather than because, being able to express it.
I mean, yeah, because something like I'm going into my phone, or I'm just going to go off and be by myself for a while, has so many possible interpretations, and the perceiver themselves isn't a blank slate either. Like, so they're trying to figure out why you're retreating, you're being aloof. Maybe they have their own insecurities or things that are going on, and then those things combine and just ignite in a really counterproductive way, when really there wasn't any, you know, one of the most common things you find is that people tend to, when a behavior is ambiguous, if anything, we tend to interpret it in a slightly negative way, especially if it might be potentially a rejecting behavior. So a lot of things that we do, not only with our partners, but with friends and colleagues through the course of a day, if that behavior has an interpretation that is possibly rejecting, like, oh, you know, when I was talking during the meeting, you weren't looking at me, you were looking off at the wall, or you were looking off into here. You know, there may be a lot of good reasons why you were doing that, but I'm going to be tempted to think it's a rejection of me, right? You don't care about what I'm talking about, or you don't think that it's interesting, and so on. So it's not even just people are wrong, they tend to be wrong and interpret it negatively. It's like a biased wrong, which is then particularly bad. I think there's a lot of people who are... David Funder is a psychologist who studies perception, and he's been particularly interested in what he calls good targets, people that actually are more readily understood by other people, that people tend to be more right about. And one of the things that's true of them is that they just do a lot more expressing, right? Like you said, they have more emotional fluency, they are better at talking about what's happening inside them so that other people understand it, but they also are more likely to explicitly say what their intentions are in a situation, to talk out loud about what they're thinking. That's hard for a lot of people, You know, I mean, obviously, if you're an introvert, you're a bit shy, you're a bit, you know, you're more of an avoidant attachment style, so you're not really interested in being very vulnerable with other people. Then you're just, all of those things increase the chances that you won't be understood by the people around you, because you really just won't be giving them that much information to go on. So it can be, I think, very, very difficult for people that have a tendency to be quiet, to be well understood by other people. It's yet another disadvantage of not being sort of an extrovert, particularly in this culture.
It's an impoverishment of data.
Yeah, which is always a problem.
I think, so speaking of this, there's a sort of clinicalness to approaching things this way, which I'm both attracted to and repulsed by. How much, I remember having a conversation a long time ago with a very fashionable friend of mine, Ellie, when you see this, and she commented on how your outfitture is the first way that you communicate with the world. And there's all of this fascinating research around the beauty gap, or the beauty premium, that the differences in attractiveness predict income differences in the same way that gender or ethnicity do. So, can you tell us a little bit about about how our appearances form like the stories that people tell themselves about us?
I mean, in a number of different ways they do it. But when we talked earlier about sort of all that stuff that's happening under the hood, right? When you're looking at somebody and your brain immediately begins to try to process them, to have to form an impression of them so that you know how to then interact with them. The very first things it has in terms of pieces of information are appearance pieces. So that would be things like how attractive the person is, or what they're wearing, and what the clothes you wear signals about the kind of person you are, maybe the groups you belong to. But of course, it's also things like gender and race. We notice these, hair color. We notice all these things immediately. And then one of the things that's happening under the hood, for better or worse, is that it's activating, each of those pieces of your appearance are activating different kind of stereotypes that we have, that we carry around. If you're a member of a particular culture, you know the stereotypes of that culture. And one of, I think, the most fascinating and simultaneously terrifying things that psychologists have learned in the last 30 years of understanding how stereotyping works is that you don't have to believe a stereotype to be affected by it. You just have to know what it is. There are people who work very hard to not have their perceptions impacted by stereotypes, but that process is fairly effortful for the most part. What happens automatically and first is that I see you, and all of the stereotypes that I might associate with your appearance start activating in my mind. And that has, obviously, when all stereotypes are wrong because they're all generalizations, right? So very often they're getting applied to people to whom that stereotype just should not apply at all. And it's influencing, again, how you interpret those ambiguous pieces of information. You and I were talking earlier about some of the more particularly horrifying aspects of that, like, for example, if you show participants in a study very quickly a fast image of a man who's either black or white holding an object, and then you ask them later to whether or not that object was a gun, they're much more likely to think that it was a gun if it was in the hands of a black man than if it was in the hands of a white man. And even when you control for it and make it equally frequent. So that's just a stereotype being activated when you see that person, and that's literally influencing then your perception of the object that's in their hand. So there's a lot of things that happen when stereotypes get activated that are just awful. There are some things that happen that are just sort of innocuous. The beauty one is interesting because that is both sort of it's a kind of a combination of effects. It's a stereotype that we tend to have about beautiful people, that they're just sort of more fabulous in general, but it's also something called the halo effect, which I know you've written about, which is that when people have one good quality, we often assume that therefore they have a bunch of other good ones, even though in real life those qualities are not related to one another. So even if in real life there is no correlation between how attractive you are and how intelligent you are, we tend to assume that more attractive people are smarter and more honest and funnier and a whole bunch of other things that have nothing to do with each other because of this halo effect. There's also the opposite of that, which is the horns effect, which is that if someone is, you perceive them to be quite negative on some dimension, then that can also seep into all of the other dimensions as well, and you see them. So an unattractive person can therefore be seen as more dishonest and unintelligent. There are some, weird. So in general, you can walk away with, and I know you've written about this, that sort of beautiful people then have it made because they have all of this bias in their favor, this unconscious bias in their favor. And for the most part, that's true. Although I know there's a few interesting exceptions to that, particularly for women. That there can be instances, for example, in hiring, where more attractive women are not hired for a position if they're being evaluated by another woman. Because then you get, it's not so much that the person who's doing the evaluating thinks that person's smart, it's just that they're threatened by them. And so it's not that there's never a downside. It's not that beauty never kind of has a cost, but in general, beauty is sort of an advantage because of all of these perceptual things going on. But again, no one would in a million years think that they thought someone was smarter because they were better looking, right? You would laugh if someone accused you of that. But it's probably happening, which is sort of the
Great.
Yeah.
How, with the amount that you've digested,
This is a good word for it.
so much of this literature, when you're meeting someone for the first time, how, like, what do you call to mind from your vast inventory of insight?
It's funny. I have become more writing the book and really kind of trying to think about it systematically. I've become more conscious of some of the things I was already doing that I didn't. A lot of when people are good at making a good impression, or generally good at making a good impression, there's a lot of things they're doing intuitively that they don't even realize they're doing, but they've kind of picked up on. So one of the things I talk about in the book is sort of how to send. When you meet people, it turns out there's sort of these two dimensions that are really important when you meet someone for the first time, and the research suggests that about like 85 to 90% of your impression of another person is accounted for by these two things. One is competence and the other is warmth, right? So in general, people are kind of aware that competence matters, right? That we kind of, when we meet someone, we want to look like we're sort of smart and capable and know things. And we're aware of that, and so we do things on purpose to make sure that we come across as competent. Unfortunately, people don't really seem to be as aware, in general, many people, that warmth is really important, and they don't know how to convey it, and they don't know when they're not doing it. So they just assume that they come across as warm, even when they come across as quite cold. And there's some very kind of concrete things you can do to come across as warm, and some of them are body language, looking at people when they're talking to you. We were talking about this before. You get told all the time that eye contact is important and to look at people, but usually the way that advice is given is you should look at people when you're talking, right? Because that's competence, right? Like if I'm looking at you when I'm talking, I must know what I'm doing. But it's really actually looking at people when they're talking is a really strong signal of warmth, kind of leaning in, doing what you're doing right now, the nod. See, you just do it. You do it intuitively, right? You weren't nodding on purpose, but the nod is actually weirdly important. If someone's talking and you don't just if you don't nod, like talk to me really quick and I'm just nod. I'll scare you. That's hard to do, isn't it? I'm sorry.
Really,
but if you've ever been in a conversation with someone who doesn't nod back when you're talking, it's so unnerving because they just sort of stare and you don't know. All of a sudden you're like, are they understanding me? Have I offended them? Like you start having all this weird anxiety. Sometimes you don't even know why. And it's because the nod is both a signal of understanding and it's like a little affirmation. You're like, yeah, I'm agreeing with you as you're saying this. And it turns out it's really important. I mean, you don't want to do it, constantly, but it's a really important signal. Smiling at people who smile at you is important. And then there's just a lot of kind of basic social stuff, but that isn't basic to a lot of people. It isn't intuitive, like asking people questions about themselves, like being curious. There's a way to express empathy that psychologists have studied called the superfluous apology, right? So a real apology is, I actually did something to you, like I step on your foot and I say I'm sorry. A superfluous apology is, oh, you're really tired from this weekend that you were at the shore? I'm sorry. You know, I'm not actually apologizing because I didn't make you tired, right? But I'm expressing empathy. So that little I'm sorry, when someone just sort of, you know, says that something bad happened to them and you just say, oh, I'm sorry, that's terrible, turns out that's really powerful. And it's just a little thing, but often when people tell us something bad happened to them, we just don't say anything. And that can come across as really cold.
It reminds me, speaking of gaps, there's a great profile from Ezra Klein on Vox about Hillary Clinton. Mm-hmm. And he like, the mystery is, why is there this gap between the public Hillary mm-hmm. and the Hillary that people know personally?
Right. Because
she doesn't play well in front of large audiences, but person to person, she inspires tremendous light. And she's such an able coalition builder, which makes her very effective in governance, but less so in campaigning. And I think that's really fascinating, because one of the points that came up again and again in this profile is that Hillary is an expert listener, and what she'll do, like one of her kind of signature moves, is when she's meeting with some policy wonk, mm-hmm. she'll bring up some obscure point about their policy recommendation to them, and then, you know, she's made their entire year.
Right, because it indicates that she cared, she was like interested. It's very affirming, right? If you're that policy wonk with the obscure knowledge, like that she would take the time to do that. Bill was a really good listener too, but he was really good at looking like he was listening. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the Clintons kind of had that going on. Bill could do the intense face, you know, when someone was on. And people always said, you know, it made them feel like they were the only person in the world. And it's an underrated thing to be able to do. I think to it's really funny. I actually was just today rewatching this clip of Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, being interviewed by Charlie Rose, and he talked about, he said one of the best thing, Fred Rogers said, one of the best things that you can do for a child is to make them feel like you're talking just to them and you're listening to them, and you know, you're really kind of focused on them, and that makes them feel special and makes them feel unique, just to kind of have that as an adult, taking that moment with them to really kind of listen and focus in. And it occurred to me when he was saying it, that it's just as true of adults. Yeah. You know, we all want that feeling of being intently listened to. And then what happens is, you know, thanks to the magic of what happens in your brain, when people do that for us, we like them so much, and we actually tend to think, being a good listener actually makes you look smart. Because people like infer that you're really intelligent because you were listening so much to what they were saying. It's wonderfully, like, cyclically beneficial. So yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me, that that particular thing that she does, which conveys so much warmth person to person, it doesn't translate to the stage. And I also do, not Hillary Clinton level speaking, but like every once in a while I have to get up in front of a group of 100 people or 500 people and talk to them about this stuff. And it is really hard you still, in any context, if you're in the front of a room or the front of a meeting, you want to be sending those warmth signals, right? You want to be making people feel valued, that you're not just sort of up there being cold and competent, which is like the worst combination. But it's very, very hard to do with a group, because, you know, it's like, I can't do the thing where I listen to all of you individually. I can't do the thing where I'm connecting and nodding when you're talking because I'm talking. Or you can do a little bit of that with Q&A, and there's things you can do, but yeah, it's not surprising that someone whose warmth really comes across that way then really can't work a crowd as well as somebody who is better at being warm and with a kind of a, you know, with their mannerisms and their body language and all of that. So that's actually, that makes a lot of sense. I hadn't actually thought about how hard it is to convey for her that particular thing in that setting. And I know it is, you know, I remember when she was first in the Senate, she was really good at being able to work with people across the aisle, which was surprising because they all hated her so much. And so I imagine it was that. Like, imagine it was that feeling of like, I'm actually listening to you. It really works. I mean, it's like a magic charm. Like, if you can make people feel like they are heard, you inspire a lot of liking and a lot of loyalty. And I mean, if it's something kind of managers and leaders could do more of too, is just really, people tend to be very loyal to managers and leaders that make them feel like they're paying attention to them individually. And one of the, I know you've written about power too, and one of the sort of great ironies there is that the more powerful a person is, typically the worse they get at doing that, because they tend to not focus on people with less power. They're too busy focusing on their goals and trying to be, you know, and in fairness, they have stuff to do because they've got a lot of power.
And the people, I forget what study, or the researcher who found this was, but people who are visionaries, who are extremely entrepreneurial, tend to live in a more symbolic world, where they're pursuing goals and world states, which means that interpersonally they can be very cold. Absolutely. Because they're because the relationship is less valuable than the outcome that they're pursuing.
Yeah, I think one way to think of it is that power refocuses attention, right? So it's not that power is evil or makes people evil, but it definitely refocuses their attention, and it makes them more instrumental with respect to other people. So it becomes more, you can get the attention of a powerful person, you can become very important to a powerful person, but to do that, you have to convince them that you can help them reach their goals. You have to convince them that you can do something of value to them with their agenda, and then you have their attention. Everyone else they tend to sort of see as kind of all the same. I mean, there's a lot of research showing when you put someone in a position of power, they stereotype more, they generalize more, they're less sort of individuating. And it really, you know what, again, it's tempting to sort of think like, oh, the people that come into power are the kind of people who would do that. But actually what the research shows is that if you just bring people into the lab at random, and you bring 5 people in and you draw one of their names out of a hat in front of all of them, and you say, okay, you get to be the leader, and the other ones are going to be the followers, and you have this certain amount of power in this situation to distribute candy bars or whatever the thing is that we're working with. And you can actually see the changes in the laboratory right in real time of how that person who's just been randomly elected the leader will think differently about all the other people in the room. So it really is an effective power, much more than power. The kind of people who seek power are the kind of people who would not care about other people and only care about their own goals. I'm not saying that none of that happens, but I think it's an important thing to keep in mind, because it means that it can happen to anybody. Like, any of us, once put in a position of power, can become less thoughtful about the people around us, pay less attention to the people that work for us. And so, you know, for anybody rising up in an organization, they kind of need to think about, you know, how can I deliberately make sure this doesn't happen? Because it's an unconscious effect. Nobody's sort of doing it on purpose, right? But how can I set aside time to pay attention to the people that work for me, and to give them that feeling that they're being heard? Because it'd be very tempting to not do that if you sort of go on autopilot. And I think so much of the stuff that I talk about in the book has that lesson over and over again. It's like you have to stop and be deliberate rather than just sort of totally system 2, right? If you just run on autopilot and you take all the shortcuts, then you're going to have you'll be efficient, but you'll have tons of problems in your interpersonal interactions with other people. You like put the brakes on, be a little thoughtful, meditate a little bit. All this is good, you know. Then you'll have a much greater chance for success, and it can come across the way you mean to, right? That's sort of the whole point. With the book, I didn't want to teach anybody how to fake being these things. I just sort of operated under the assumption that most people reading it actually do mean to come across, like, do care about the people around them, do mean to come across as warm, do mean to be sort of good eggs, and they're just not managing it, and they don't know why. I'm getting a signal from the producer.
Yeah, we have some questions.
Oh, we have questions.
Really
okay.
Fantastic.
Kay asks. Kay says, "I'm feeling vocal. I'm vocal, and I still feel misunderstood because I say what others won't say, or bring to light what others won't bring to light. It's like calling out the elephant in the room." I think she's asking, how do I deal with that situation where I'm vocal, but I still feel really misunderstood because of that?
I don't know. It depends on what the source of the misunderstanding is, right? So if you feel like that people are misunderstanding your intentions, right, by doing that. So I mean, the easiest thing is to say, well, maybe don't identify the elephant in the room quite as much, but I don't think you probably want to do that, because I think that's probably a part of your personality and who you are, and it's not a bad thing. But it might be that by doing that, people are misunderstanding why you're doing it. Like that your intention is not to make people uncomfortable, but that you actually have good intentions by doing that, and so very often you might be vocal about a lot of things, but maybe not vocal about the thing you need to be vocal about, which is sort of what your thinking is when you do that, and why you're doing it, and how you want other people to feel about it, right?
The Kanye West effect.
Yeah. Exactly. Poor Kanye, he means well. He really does, but people just don't understand. I honestly do think if he explained a little bit more about why he did some of the things he did, that he would make more sense to people. He might not still agree with him, but he would make a lot more sense. And I do think that's often, if there is still a misunderstanding, you're not giving them the information they need to bridge the gap. So maybe just think about what is the perception they have of you, and then how can you correct that by being really explicit about what's going on.
Cool. We have another one, or two more. Betsy said, should we explain upfront that we need some downtime, or be proactive about needing time to process a request at work to reduce anxiety? And is it good to anticipate that people will have anxiety and tend towards negativity?
Yes, right?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, being proactive about it is great. Explaining, I live in a world with a lot of people who have introvert tendencies, and because it just seems like a lot of academics and writers have those, and for good reason. And it's very easy to when you need that downtime, you need to kind of just have those moments to yourself, to just assume that other people understand that, and they may not, because they don't know. Not that they don't understand the need for it, and they don't understand introversion, but they just don't understand that is what is happening right now.
Yeah.
Right? They don't know that it's not a rejection of them. They, and especially if someone's waiting for an answer for something, like the second part of the question, right? It was like, do I want to tell people I need time to process that? Yes, definitely. Because otherwise your silence could be interpreted in a ton of negative ways. So anytime you can sort of say what's actually happening, right? Like, I need this time for me, or I need some time to think about this. It just lets people off the hook, right? They just can go like, oh, okay, then fine, take time, it's great. And just because someone is also like that doesn't mean they'll automatically understand it. I've had that happen to me where even though I do understand very much the need to be by myself and be alone, if somebody does that in my life without telling me like that's what's going on, I'm just as capable as anybody of feeling like, oh wait, was it about me? So you have to kind of not assume that people will understand it and interpret it correctly.
And I think it goes back to the relationship advice.
Yeah.
If you don't give people, if you don't use your words,
It comes up a lot.
and give people access to your interior space, then they might theoretically understand that you have
Right.
needs and you need to titrate your stimulation intake.
I like that.
But
I'm
it's
stealing that.
But it's up to each of us to be able to identify and communicate our needs.
Right. Yeah. It's you're so much better off. If you're going to make an assumption in a situation, assume they don't understand, rather than assuming they do. And even if they end up, so the worst case scenario is they go like, oh yeah, I know, like they're just not bad at all. And then on the other side, you run into all kinds of problems. So yeah, better safe than sorry.
Cool.
Any other ones?
Yeah, last one.
Okay.
One more from Stephen,
Hi,
who wonders if you have any general impression management advice for, and this is one everybody I'm sure asks you, for delivering information to others that might be perceived as unfavorable or disruptive. How do you deliver that without damaging your relationship with the receivers of the message?
That's a good question, right? How to give, I know you've written about this kind of stuff too, how to give like negative feedback. I think it's never a bad thing to start with a little bit of reassurance. And I don't mean like, there's a lot of nonsense out there about things like the sandwich. And the sandwich is silly. Like, don't give the feedback sandwich, that's ridiculous. Positive, negative, positive doesn't solve any problems unless you're doing it right. Like, what matters is the kind of thing that you're saying. So it can help in those situations to sort of start by giving the person the context of why you're saying it. And it can help to give some reassurance. It doesn't have to be like a compliment, but some reassurance that, you're giving them this, but you want them to know, like in the context of work, for example, that you want to talk to them about something, but you want to start just by telling that you think that, you're really like the job that they're doing, and you think they're great, and then you think that the reason you're telling them this is because you think it's something that would be useful for them to help them grow. And so explaining, just going a little bit further, not just sort of saying here's the comment, but here's the background, and here's why I'm telling you this, and here's a little bit of reassurance that I think that you'll benefit from hearing this. All of that, and that works in relationships too. It's like to sort of acknowledge maybe from the beginning, I appreciate that you've done X, Y, and Z. I want to talk to you about this other thing because it's troubling me, and I know that you don't mean to do that, right? Some reassurance that you feel like the relationship is still good, but you just want to solve this problem. Because I think a lot of times what happens is if you just go for the criticism, then immediately the person's mind goes to the relationship, whether it's a work relationship or a personal one, the relationship is in jeopardy.
And catastrophizing.
Yeah, completely catastrophizing. It blows up out of proportion. It's like becomes a global thing instead of a specific thing. I think if you start by giving the reassurance and the context and the assurance that the relationship is good, then people are open to hearing, much more open to hearing, certainly, whatever it is that you have to say.
And then the framing goes from being one of conflict to one of cooperation.
Right. Like, how can we, and it's amazing to watch that happen, even in arguments that I've had that have started out being conflict, and then you kind of work to that place where it begins to be cooperation, and all of a sudden the tenor of it's, so, you start having that back and forth with the person, and like, well, I acknowledge this, well, I also acknowledge this, and all of a sudden it's this really healthy and productive thing, and it's like, you can actually skip the first part. You don't need to sort of slog through the conflict to get to that. You can start there by just sort of setting that tone, by sort of starting with a reassurance, and then offering the criticism, and then and again, offering it not in a defensive way, offering people to sort of say, and what do you think of that? What's your view of that? And inviting them to have a view too. So it never feels like it isn't a kind of a conversation between two people who care about each other. Well, that was fun. So do we just sign off? Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Have a great night.
Namaste.